I stood in the doorway of what used to be my room, the closet stripped bare, drawers emptied, shelves wiped clean, like I'd never existed. A new throw rug covered the hardwood floor, cheap and floral, nothing like the one I picked out as a "You don't deserve a space here," Melissa had said, handing me a box of my own memories like junk to. After raising her daughter when she wouldn't, after folding laundry in this house for 20 years, after giving up every corner of my life to keep this family stitched together. Now, even the walls refused to remember me, but the floorboards still did. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The air in Eleanor's room was thick with dust and the acrid scent of fresh resentment. Daniel's voice, already sharp with him, cut through the quiet like a blade. "Mom, it's time you downsize." His words weren't a suggestion, they were a command, a dismissal. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight. She had been there for hours, silently watching as the movers dumped her possession, decades of memory, into cardboard boxes. Some of them, the fragile ones, were shoved in without care, their delicate edges cracking. Old photo albums were tossed onto the floor like forgotten relics. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Melissa stood near the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her. "Honestly, Eleanor, do you really think this place is still yours?" Her voice was honeyed but dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe it's time to let go of these old things. The house isn't even worth what you think anymore." Eleanor's eyes flicked over to Claire, who was standing near the window, clearly uncomfortable, her gaze darting between her mother and grandmother. There was a flicker of pain in Claire's eyes, but she said nothing. The quiet girl she had always been to shrink under the weight of the room. As the movers began piling things up by the door, Claire hesitated. She walked across, moving carefully, trying not to. Then, as if on instinct, she grabbed a small photo frame from the side table, tucked it under her jacket. It was a picture of Eleanor and her late husband, taken on their wedding day. A memory too important to be discarded, too fragile to be forgotten. For a brief moment, Eleanor's eyes met Claire's. No words were spoken, but in that quiet glance, there was understanding, a shared defiance. Eleanor turned her gaze back to the chaos, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't angry, she was simply tired, too tired to fight. Her hand still rested in her lap, each finger pressing into the worn fabric of her old cardigan, grounding her to the place that, despite the noise and the hurt, was still home. When the movers finally left, taking with them half of what was left of her life, Daniel turned to her with a smug expression. "You're just taking up space, Mom. Maybe this will teach you to simplify." His words were cold, almost cruel, as he surveyed the barren room. Melissa gave a half laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, because clearly you've had so much stuff, you couldn't even remember half of it. Right, Eleanor?" Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence that hung in the air was louder than any response could. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the porch, Martha found Eleanor sitting alone, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was unreadable, a mask of quiet dignity, but the tears were there, just beneath the surface, glistening in the corner of her eye. "Martha!" Eleanor's voice cracked, but only slightly. The weight of everything seemed to hit her now that the house was empty. "I don't know what to do anymore." Martha didn't say anything for a long time. She sat down beside her, the old wooden swing creaking under their combined weight. Finally, after a long silence, Martha spoke softly, her voice as steady as the roots of the oak tree behind. "Don't let them break you, Eleanor. This house, this life, it means something. It means you mean something." Eleanor looked at her old friend, her gaze distant. The light from the porch lamp illuminated her face, drawing out the deep lines and creases that marked the years. "Walls keep secret," Eleanor whispered, the words hanging in the air like a prophecy. "And this one has kept mine." Martha didn't press her, though she could feel the gravity of Eleanor's words. She had always known there was more to Eleanor's quiet strength than anyone else realized, but she hadn't expected the pain to be so sharp, so buried under the surface. Eleanor rose to her feet slowly, her body stiff but resolute. "They think they've won, Martha. They think they've taken everything from me." Her voice was low, filled with an unexpected strength. "But they haven't. Not yet." Martha nodded, though she wasn't sure if Eleanor was speaking to her or to herself. As Eleanor turned to walk back inside, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Just one, but enough to. A small reminder that even the strongest people carry wounds too deep. The porch light flickered once, casting long shadows across. Eleanor paused at the door. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes resolute. The walls of the house might keep secret, but she wasn't going to let them be forgotten. Not yet. The house was quieter now. The familiar creak of the wooden floors, once a comforting sound, felt like a reminder of all the things slipping away. Eleanor stood in the middle of her room, staring at the closet door. Her eyes narrowed, catching something odd in the wood near the baseboard. A warped plank that didn't sit quite right with the others. It wasn't much, but it was enough to catch her attention. She crouched down, her fingers tracing the edge of the wooden floorboard. Something about it felt different. The light from the single lamp overhead cast long, wavering shadows, making the edges of the floorboards seem darker, more sinister. The world outside was darkening, and the air in the room was thick with the dust of years-long. Eleanor's hand hovered for a moment before she gently pressed on the edge of the plank. It didn't budge, but something in the silence whispered to her. She pushed harder, and with a faint groan, the board shifted slightly, revealing a crack. She could feel the faint thrum of something hidden beneath the surface, a secret buried deep within the house that had been kept from her for far too long. Her breath caught, a flash of hope sparking in her chest. But then, her eyes caught Claire's, standing in the doorway, hesitating. Eleanor had forgotten her granddaughter was still awake. The girl, usually so quiet, was always just on the edge of the action, never quite part of it, but always watching. "Grandma." Claire's voice was soft, tentative, but there was a flicker of something else there. Curiosity, maybe even fear. She was nervous, as she always was, but Eleanor could see the way her granddaughter's gaze lingered on the hidden spot in the floor. Eleanor straightened, giving her a slow, knowing look. "I'm going to see something, Claire. You don't have to come." Claire didn't move, but Eleanor could see the battle inside her, her reluctance to push too far, her instincts to protect herself and her grandmother from whatever might be uncovered. But after a long moment, Claire stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her eyes met Eleanor's with a mix of worry and resolve. "I'm coming with you," she said quietly, as though the decision had already been made. The flashlight flickered to life in Eleanor's. She crouched down again, Claire kneeling beside her, both of them now hunched low, staring at the strange gap in the floor. "Do you think something's down there?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever was hidden. Eleanor didn't answer at first. She only studied the crack in the floorboard, her mind racing with the possibility. There was something here, something they hadn't known about, something important. She could feel it in her bones. Carefully, Eleanor worked her fingers beneath the edge of the warped board, her nails scraping against the wood. The sound was soft at first, but it seemed to reverberate in the silence, of each scrape a promise of what was. With a final tug, the board lifted. It came away with a faint thud, revealing a small, dusty space beneath it. Eleanor's heart quickened. She reached inside, feeling around for something solid, something real. Her fingers brushed against a wooden box, rough to the touch, but solid. Claire inhaled sharply. "Grandma, what is it?" Eleanor's voice was low, almost reverent as she pulled the box free. "It's evidence," she whispered. Her eyes glinted in the soft light of the flashlight, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The box was old, its surface worn by time, but its corners were sharp, and the hinges seemed intact, despite years of neglect. Eleanor set it gently on the floor, dust motes rising around them like tiny ghosts. She brushed the dirt from the top, revealing a brass lock. "Do you think it's important?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible, her fingers itching to reach out and open. Eleanor's eyes were distant, but there was a flicker of recognition. She didn't know what was inside, but she knew whatever it was. It was tied to the house, to her past, to everything she'd been through, and it was now. "I think," she said slowly, her voice firm and determined, "it's everything they've tried to hide." Claire shifted nervously, her gaze flicking between her grandmother and the box. What if it's dangerous?" Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Dangerous people hide dangerous things." Her fingers worked with careful precision as she unlatched the box. The small click of the lock felt like the softest kind of explosion, reverberating in the room. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid. Inside, stacked neatly, were old, deep, yellowing letters and several sealed envelopes. The paper was fragile, the ink faded in places, but it was clear enough to. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she ran her fingers over the letters. They were dated. Old letters from years ago, all addressed to someone she didn't recognize. Claire leaned closer, her voice shaky. "Grandma, what's this?" Eleanor didn't answer at first. Her mind was racing, piecing things together. She could see it now. The tangled web of lies, the hidden truths, the things she had been denied for so long. These papers, these envelopes, they were her past, and they were finally being uncovered. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking in the weight of it all. Then, with a quiet certainty, she whispered, "Evidence of everything they've done." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with the promise of what was to come. Outside, the wind howled against the house, rattling the windows like a warning. Eleanor didn't flinch. The small wooden box sat on the kitchen table, its presence almost sacred in the low light of the air was thick with silence, save for the soft ticking of the old wall clock, each second passing with the weight of something unresolved. Eleanor's hands, steady but trembling, sifted through the papers one by one. She started with the oldest, a simple piece of parchment, the ink faded but still legible. Her heart raced as she read the line, the words anchoring her to a truth she hadn't known was hidden. Property solely under her late husband's name, scrawled on the deed, but the ownership was unequivocally hers. The weight of the words settled over her like a heavy blanket, thick with both relief and dread. They hadn't told her. Daniel had insisted for years that everything would pass to him. He'd used every tactic, every manipulation to push her aside. But this deed, was a final, definitive answer. Claire stood behind her, watching quietly, sensing her grandmother's shock. She had been quiet since the box had been opened, but now she moved closer, leaning over Eleanor. "What does it mean, Grandma? Does this mean—" Eleanor raised a hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means they've lied. All along, they've lied." Her fingers brushed over the brittle edges of the paper, then moved to the next envelope. The second one was thicker, its contents hidden away for far too long. Eleanor hesitated. She had known her late husband, Daniel's father, had kept certain matters private. But the contents of this letter, what could it possibly say? With a deep breath, Eleanor pulled the flap open, the paper crackling as she unfolded it carefully. Inside, she found a letter from an attorney. The date was years old, almost lost to time, but the words were clear. It was a letter she was never meant to see, a letter meant for her, but never delivered. It was about the family trust, the one Daniel had claimed didn't exist, the one he had said was a misunderstanding. Eleanor's pulse quickened. The letter outlined the trust's terms, conditions, and, most importantly, her right to the estate. It had been hidden, tucked away from her, deliberately. Her stomach churned as she realized how much of her life had been orchestrated by her son's lies. He'd manipulated her, assuming she wouldn't ask the right question. But now, this document proved everything. Claire stood beside her now, her eyes wide. "Grandma, you have to show Naomi. She's the lawyer, right? She can help. She can do something with." Eleanor was silent for a moment, her fingers lingering on the letter. The urge to act was strong. Naomi Blake was her best chance at reclaiming everything that had been taken from her. But there was something else, something gnawing at her. "They've taken so much from me already." Eleanor, her voice distant. "If they find out I have this," she trailed off, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Claire's voice was firm, insistent. "You have to show Naomi, Grandma. She'll know what to do. We can't let them get away with this." Eleanor nodded slowly, but the thought of putting her trust in someone else, someone who was, at best, a stranger in her fight, made her pause. She had always handled things on her own, but now, the burden of this discovery felt too heavy to carry alone. Martha's voice interrupted her thoughts, clear and unwavering. "Make copies, Eleanor. Make sure no one can get their hands on the original. We don't know what they'll do next, but we can't afford to lose the—" Eleanor looked up at her old friend, who had entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. There was wisdom in Martha's eyes, a quiet knowledge that had always helped guide Eleanor through difficult. Eleanor nodded again, a flicker of gratitude in her expression. She was used to bearing her burdens alone, but now, with Martha and Claire by her side, she felt a glimmer of support, fragile but real. "All right," Eleanor said softly, as though speaking to herself more than anyone else. "I'll make copies. The originals, those will go to a safe deposit box. No one gets to." She stood up, gathering the papers into a neat pile. She could feel the weight of the documents in her hands, heavy with years of secrets and lies. Claire moved to help, her hands shaking as she reached for the stack. "Grandma, do you think this will make a difference?" Eleanor's gaze hardened, her voice low and steady. It will. Because now, I have proof. And I won't let them take what's mine. With a deliberate motion, Eleanor stood, walking toward the drawer where she kept her most important possession, her husband's watch, her old letters, the things that mattered. She placed the original documents into a thick envelope, securing them carefully. The keys to the safe deposit box lay in her palm, cool and metallic, as she slid the envelope inside. It felt like sealing a part of her future, a future that had been denied her for far too long. She looked at Claire, and then at Martha. A small, determined smile tugged at the corners of her lips. They wanted me gone, Eleanor, her voice quiet but resolute. But these, she paused, her fingers lingering on the envelope. These keep. The room was still, but the weight of her words seemed to settle into the walls, as though the house itself had heard her declaration. Outside, the wind picked, rattling the windows, a warning or maybe a promise that things were about to change. Eleanor didn't flinch. Eleanor sat in the living room, her eyes trained on the small stack of papers on the table before her. They looked innocuous, just another pile of documents she'd been forced to. But this one was different. The ink on the petition was freshly printed, crisp and sharp. Daniel had filed for guardianship. Her fingers traced the words as she read them for the third time, each one more infuriating than the last. Daniel was claiming she was mentally slipping. The word slipping echoed in her mind, the weight of the accusation pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She could almost hear Daniel's voice, soft and patronizing, telling her she was too old, too fragile to handle things. But Eleanor wasn't fragile. The walls of her home, her sanctuary, had been breached in the most insidious way. She had always been the rock, the quiet force behind her family's existence, but now it felt as though her very worth was being questioned. How dare he? How dare he challenge her like this? Her hands clenched into fists. They think I'm slipping. They think they can break me. The front door creaked open, and Eleanor didn't need to look up to know it was Martha. The older woman entered, her presence filling the room like it always. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside Eleanor, her hand resting on. Naomi will help, Martha said quietly, as if sensing the storm brewing inside Eleanor. Eleanor nodded but didn't speak. She couldn't trust herself to say the words. Not yet. A knock sounded on the door, and Claire entered without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes were wide, the tension in her shoulders betraying her. She looked from Eleanor to the petition, her brow furrowed. "What is this, Grandma?" she asked, her voice tinged with both disbelief and worry. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Daniel's trying to take control of my life. He's saying I'm not fit to take care of myself." Claire's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That's not true, Grandma. You're as sharp as anyone. I'll testify for you. I'll tell them what I know." Eleanor met her gaze, her heart swelling with pride at her granddaughter's offer. "Thank you, Claire," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I won't need you to speak for me." Claire's eyes searched Eleanor's face as though seeking an explanation, but Eleanor only shook her head. "I won't whisper," Eleanor said, her voice low and firm. "I'll answer for myself." Later that week, Eleanor sat in the sterile, cold exam room, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above her making her skin crawl. The air smelled of antiseptic, sharp, and unfamiliar. She had been through so much already, but this, the competency exam, felt like another humiliation she had to endure. She looked around the room, noticing the faint, subtle cracks in the walls, the chipped edges of the old furniture. It was as though everything was being scrutinized. If only they knew how many times I'd been examined, tested, forced to endure the trivialities of life. The door clicked open, and a man entered, a doctor, by the looks. He was in his mid-40s, with round glasses perched on his nose. He smiled faintly as he glanced at the clipboard in his. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Dr. Simon. I'm here to conduct a brief competency, if that's all right with you." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gave him a steady, unwavering look. Competent. Another word Daniel had chosen, another way to strip away her autonomy. She would show him. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm, controlled. The exam proceeded like a scripted play. Basic questions, simple answers. What year was it? Who was the president? What is your address? Each question was a challenge, a test not of her mental faculty, but of her resolve. She answered them all, sharp, clear, unbroken. Dr. Simon made notes as he asked more questions, his voice quiet, almost distant, as if this was a routine, just another patient, another case. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his notes. "Mrs. Hayes," he said after a long pause, You seem to be in full possession of your mental faculty. You're aware of your surroundings. You're coherent in your responses. There's no indication of cognitive decline at this. Eleanor's chest tightened with a quiet victory. There was no slipping. There was no decline. The truth stood in the room with her, strong and unyielding. Thank you, doctor, she said, rising to her feet. Dr. Simon smiled again, standing as well. No problem. I'll submit my report to the court, and they'll make the final determination. But based on what I've seen, I don't see any cause for concern. Eleanor nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe as she passed through, leaving the sterile room behind. As she stepped outside, the weight of the petition still hung over her, but she knew something now. She knew that they were underestimating. They thought her age made her. They thought her silence made her powerless, but she wasn't finished yet. And this wasn't over. Later, when she returned home, Martha and Claire were waiting for her, the tension in the air palpable. Eleanor took a deep breath as she walked into the room, the storm brewing inside her now palpable in every step she took. Naomi will help, Martha said again, more forcefully. Eleanor looked at Claire, and then at Martha. The storm inside her was no longer a quiet rumble. It was an unstoppable force, ready to sweep everything its path. I'll help myself, Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with a quiet power, and outside, the wind howled again, as if the house itself were bracing for what was to. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The oak benches creaked under the weight of those in attendance, the air thick with the bitter scent of power and frustration. Eleanor sat at the table, her back straight, her fingers folded in her lap. For once, she didn't feel like the one on trial. This was her moment. Naomi Blake stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding attention. She was calm, collected, every motion deliberate, every word chosen with precision. She placed a thick stack of papers onto the table before the judge, sliding them across to the opposing side. The judge, an older man with a sharp gaze, peered down at the stack, then up at Naomi. "What is this, Ms. Blake?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. Naomi's lips quirked in the smallest of smiles. "An audit, Your Honor. The financial records from the past 5 years of the Hayes family. I believe you'll find some discrepancies that merit investigation." Eleanor sat up straighter, her heartbeat quickening. Discrepancy. That was an understatement. With a sharp movement, Naomi opened the folder, revealing a series of spreadsheets and bank statements, each one meticulously. As she presented the documents, she outlined the finding. There were discrepancies between what Daniel had claimed on his tax returns and the actual expenditure. Funds were funneled into personal accounts. Luxury items were purchased, things that had nothing to do with the family estate or even with basic living expenses. "Your Honor," Naomi continued, her voice steady, "there are multiple instances of unauthorized transfer, accounts opened in Daniel Hayes's name without the proper signature, and money spent on gambling debt. In short, there's a clear pattern of misuse, financial exploitation." Eleanor watched as the weight of Naomi's words sank into the courtroom, her son's smug expression slowly starting to falter. The murmurs of the spectators were like a rising tide, growing louder with each new revelation. Daniel sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes darting from the judge to the papers. He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. The face he had shown to the world, calm, assured, entitled, was crumbling before his eyes. "Are these claims verified?" The judge's voice broke through the tension, his gaze now fixed firmly on Daniel. Naomi nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. These findings have been reviewed by an independent forensic accountant. They've been verified beyond a reasonable doubt." Eleanor felt a small, vindictive smile tug at the corner. "So this is what it feels like to have the truth on your side." The financial empire Daniel had built on lies was finally starting to crack. "Your Honor," Naomi added, "I request that the family accounts be frozen pending a full review of these transactions." The judge nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time, there was no questioning or delay in his words. "Agreed. Court orders the freeze of all financial accounts under Daniel Hayes's name, pending investigation." The gavel came down with a sharp bang, and in that moment, Eleanor felt the weight of the world shift. The tables were turning. For the first time, the scales weren't tipped in Daniel's favor. As the courtroom cleared, the tension in the room thickened. Melissa stormed out, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, her face flushed with fury. Daniel followed closely behind her, his fists clenched at his sides. Eleanor could hear their voices rising in the hallway. "How could you let this happen?" Melissa hissed, her words sharp and cutting. We need to fix this. Now. Everything. Everything is on the line. If they find out what we've done. Daniel's voice was low, his tone strained. I told you to stay quiet. We have to cover our tracks before they get the wrong idea. Claire, who had been standing by the door, froze at the sound of her parents' words. She looked at Eleanor, eyes wide with disbelief. Cover their tracks? Before she could say anything, Martha, who had been sitting beside Eleanor, rose to her feet. Her hand found Eleanor's shoulder, squeezing it gently but with fierce affection. The tables have turned, Eleanor, Martha murmured, her voice thick with emotion. This is just the beginning. Eleanor didn't need to look at her to know that Martha was right. The game had shifted. The balance of power was no longer in Daniel's hands. It was in her. I knew this day would come, Eleanor whispered, almost to herself, as she watched her son and daughter-in-law retreat into the hallway. But this, her voice was low, resolute. This will be the end of their lives. Naomi came over to them, her face impassive but her eyes flickering with satisfaction. It's just the start. We'll need to follow through. But this is a big win. Eleanor nodded. I'm ready. As the trio made their way out of the courthouse, the air felt different. It was as if the very earth beneath their feet had shifted, pushing forward into something more just. But even as she walked out into the fresh air, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The truth was finally out there. But the fight was far from over, and as the breeze lifted the strands of her hair, Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying a quiet but powerful certainty. And they'll keep turning. The air in the house was thick with tension. Eleanor sat in her favorite chair, the familiar creaks of the old wood beneath her, a comforting contrast to the chaos bubbling just beyond the door. The silence was shattered by the harsh sound of the front door slamming. Daniel's voice rang through the hallway, sharp, demanding, Where did you get those papers? Eleanor didn't move. She didn't flinch. She knew this moment was coming, and she had prepared herself for it. Slowly, she lowered her gaze from the window, meeting his eyes with a calmness that cut through the heat of his fury. Her hands remained folded in her lap, steady as the house itself. I asked you a question, Mother. Daniel's words were low, but there was a threat hanging in the air, almost tangible. He was desperate. His eyes darted around the room as though expecting the papers to be somewhere in view, but Eleanor had already hidden them. He wasn't going to find them, not unless she wanted him. Eleanor remained silent. She didn't need to answer. The truth was already out. Melissa appeared in the doorway behind him, her eyes narrowed, a cruel smile curling her lips. She stepped forward, arms crossed, the tension between them palpable. You have no idea what you've done, do you, Eleanor? Her voice was venomous, thick with a disdain that was almost too much to bear. We've lost everything. Daniel's fists clenched, his jaw tight, as if he were fighting back the urge to shout. We will lose everything, all because of your little game. He took a step closer, his voice dipping into a dangerous whisper. You don't even know what's at stake here, do you? Eleanor's gaze was steady. There was no fear in her eyes. There had been fear once, but it had been burned away over the years, along with so many other things. She had learned how to silence it, how to stand tall even in the face of everything trying to tear her down. Melissa's eyes glittered with malice. You think they'll believe you? That lawyer of yours, she can't save you now. You're just a relic, Eleanor, a shadow of what you used to be. And when all this falls apart, you'll be the one left standing alone, with nothing but the ruins of your pride. Claire had been standing at the edge of the room, her body rigid, her eyes flicking between her parents and her grandmother. But as the confrontation escalated, she took a quiet step back, her phone hidden in her. The camera was on, recording their every word. Daniel's attention flickered to Claire for a moment, his eyes narrowing as though sensing something off, but he quickly turned his focus back to Eleanor. Tell me where you hid them. Tell me now, or I swear. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a knife. You're not in control anymore. The words were quiet, but they rang with undeniable power. Daniel froze, the shock momentarily stopping him in his tracks. His breath caught, his fingers twitching at his sides. He wasn't used to this. His whole life had been about controlling everything, every detail, every moment. But here she was, his mother, calm and unyielding, standing in her own. Where did you get them, Mother? He repeated, his voice shaking, though he tried to hide it. Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth had already been laid out for him, in the courtroom, in the documents she had revealed. But his pride, his arrogance, wouldn't let him accept it. Behind him, Melissa let out a low hiss, her teeth gritted. You really think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. We'll tear everything down, Eleanor, and you'll be left with nothing. Claire, who had been standing silently, her phone still recording, stepped forward just slightly. Her voice was quiet, but the conviction in it was unmistakable. You're wrong, Mom. Grandma's not alone. She has Naomi, and she has me. Eleanor glanced at her granddaughter, her gaze soft, but filled with a fierce protectiveness. There was no hesitation and no fear. She had made her choice, and it was clear. She was standing with Eleanor. As the seconds ticked by, Eleanor's mind raced. She was calm, but there was no doubt in her heart that this was just the beginning. Naomi had what they needed. The financial fraud was already exposed, and now, with Claire's help, they had the recordings. The truth would be impossible to escape. Naomi's voice echoed in Eleanor's. This is only the beginning. Her attention shifted back to Daniel, who was now pacing, his face red with anger, his hands shaking. He had no more tricks left to play. The game was over for him. Eleanor stood slowly, her body stiff but strong. She walked past her son, her gaze unwavering. As she moved toward the door, she turned her head slightly, just enough to speak softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've lived with worse storms, she said, her words heavy with the weight of her past, the weight of everything she had endured. And I'll weather this one. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel and Melissa stood frozen, stunned by the quiet strength Eleanor had always possessed, but they had never truly seen. Outside, the wind began to howl, a storm building on the horizon, just like the one inside. And Eleanor, standing at the threshold, knew that the hardest part was still to come. The morning after the courtroom's revelation, the world had already shifted. The sun rose over Asheville with a dull certainty, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. But the calm of the town was shattered when the news broke. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around the handle of a warm mug. The scent of coffee filled the air, but she barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on the front page of the local paper. Local matriarch exposes family fraud. Daniel Hayes under investigation. The headline blared in bold, the words seizing her attention like an unexpected visitor. The photo accompanying it was hers, a quiet shot of her leaving the courthouse, her chin raised with an unspoken defiance. She had always thought that the world would forget about her, that she would slip into the shadows as the years passed. But the truth had a way of cutting through the fog of obscurity. It had a way of making people pay. As Eleanor read, the weight of it settled over her. The article was clear and damning, outlining how Daniel had exploited his mother, embezzling family funds for his own luxury and gambling. The investigation was now in full swing, the community's sympathy shifting in her favor. It felt like the world was waking up, but this wasn't the victory she had imagined. The doorbell rang, a sharp sound that sliced through the heavy silence. Eleanor set down the paper, her fingers lingering on the edges, and stood to answer. As she opened the door, a neighbor from down the street stood there, his face grim, his hands trembling at his sides. Eleanor, he began, his voice laced with, I just wanted to say how sorry I am for what happened to you. We never knew, not really, but now, we're with you, the whole neighborhood. You deserve more than this. Behind him, other faces appeared, some familiar, some not, all of them nodding in silent agreement. They had come to stand by her, not because they knew her well, but because the truth had drawn them in. Eleanor smiled softly, nodding her thanks. Words felt insufficient, but she knew what they meant. For years, she had been dismissed, but now, as the light of truth poured over everything, they could see what had been done to her. Inside the house, Claire moved quietly through the hallway, overhearing snippets of the conversation. The shift was becoming more obvious. At first, she had been hesitant, uncertain about taking sides. But now, her gaze met her grandmother's from across the room, and there was no question. They were on the same side. Grandma, Claire said softly, stepping into the kitchen, I'm proud of you. You're finally being seen. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. And you, Claire, you were my strength. Claire smiled, but there was something else in her eyes now. A glint of something stronger than just admiration. She was beginning to understand the weight of standing up, of confronting what had been buried for so long, and she was ready to fight. In the midst of it all, Naomi called. Her voice was clear over the phone, calm as always, but there was an edge of excitement in it. The probate hearing is soon. We've got everything we need. We're moving forward, Ellen. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. This was it. The the moment she'd waited for. She had the truth, the support of her community, and now, with Naomi's help, the legal power to make sure that Daniel would be held accountable. Good, Eleanor replied, her voice steady. Then it's time to finish what we started. Later that day, Martha dropped by, a homemade pie in hand. She set it down on the counter, her smile wide as she looked at Eleanor. Truth is contagious, my friend, she said, her voice filled with a quiet joy. And so is courage. Eleanor chuckled softly, the sound rich with years of experience. The truth isn't always easy, she said, but it's the only thing that lasts. And courage, well, that's a muscle you build, one painful step at a time. Martha's laughter filled the room, warm and genuine. It felt like the first real breath of air in a long time. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting its golden light across the old farmhouse, Eleanor stood at the window, gazing out at the quiet. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself again. Not a relic, not a shadow, but the woman who had endured, who had weathered the storms, and who would face the next one, just as she always. Outside, the wind began to swirling the leaves in a dance of its own. The storm was not over, but the fight, her fight, had just begun. And Eleanor whispered to herself, her voice filled with quiet determination, and I'll keep standing. The doorbell rang once more, but this time she didn't flinch. She was ready. The truth had already been set in motion. It was unstoppable. As she turned to face the sound of footsteps approaching, she knew one thing for certain. The world would remember her name, and this time it would be for the right reason. Room was thick with the weight of new revelation. Naomi sat across from an array of documents spread across. The once comfortable space now felt foreign, the quiet hum of the world outside a stark contrast to the storm that had taken root in the house. Here, Naomi said, flipping through the pages with a sharp, practiced motion. She stopped at a set of documents, turning them toward Eleanor. This is the beginning of what we're dealing with. Eleanor leaned in, her eyes scanning the print. On the top page were the names of various banks, the dates marking entries that were not at all what gambling debts. Naomi continued, tens of thousands, tied directly to Daniel's name. We're going to need this for the upcoming hearings. Eleanor's breath hitched, but she said nothing. She had known her son was reckless, but the reality of his action, his inability to distinguish between personal indulgence and responsibility, struck her like a slap. He had used everything she had worked for, everything she had built, to fuel his selfish habit. As Naomi flipped through more pages, the full extent of Daniel's actions became clear. The charges were growing. There are more gambling debts here, linked to multiple casinos in Las Vegas. Naomi said, it's not just one incident, it's an ongoing pattern. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. There was something almost surreal about it, the way the truth, piece by piece, was coming together. Her son's debts had been hidden for years, his lies sweeping through their lives like a virus, and now, the evidence irrefutable. Melissa's name is here too, Naomi added, pointing to another set of records. Look at these credit card statements. Thousands spent on shopping sprees, far beyond what was reasonable, let alone necessary. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She had always suspected, always known there was something insidious in Melissa's desire for luxury, for appearances. But to see the proof, to know that her son's wife had been complicit, it stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. Together, they've built a fortress of lies, Naomi said, as if reading Eleanor's mind. But with this is the foundation of their undoing. Eleanor didn't speak for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the page. Her mind raced through the years, the silent compromises, the quiet betrayals. It was all there, in black and white. And now, the truth would speak louder than any accusation ever could. Claire entered the room then, holding her phone with a tight grip. She looked at the document, her eyes narrowing as she saw the names and figures. Grandma, she said, her voice steady. I found something. Eleanor turned to her granddaughter, her heart sinking in her chest. What is it, Claire? Claire handed over the phone, showing Eleanor the screenshots she had taken. They were text messages between Daniel and Melissa. The texts were a trail of proof of their calculated manipulation, each message a breadcrumb leading to the truth. I didn't want to get involved in this, Claire said, her voice quiet but firm. But now, it's clear what they've been doing. Eleanor studied her heart pounding in her chest. This is everything Naomi said, leaning forward. With these texts, we have an unbroken timeline of fraud. The civil claim becomes much stronger. The room was silent for a long moment. Eleanor felt the weight of it all. The betrayal, The years of being silent, the shame that had been thrust upon her. But now, with each document, each piece of evidence, the scales were tipping. The lies, the manipulation, they would be undone. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about taking back control, reclaiming what had always been hers. Eleanor stood slowly, moving to the window. Outside, the sky was heavy with the promise of rain, the clouds swirling in dark, ominous pattern. The storm was coming, and this time, it was her storm to ride. Every record speaks louder than insults, she whispered to herself, her voice soft but resolute. Naomi looked up at her, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. And every truth spoken is a step closer to justice. The sound of rain began to drum against the windows, steady and unrelenting. Eleanor's heart was calm now, her pulse steady as she turned back to the room. The storm outside was a reflection of the battle she'd fought her whole life. It had tested her, broken her, rebuilt her, and now, with the truth in her hands, she would weather whatever came next. "Let them come," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a strength that had only grown. "I'm ready." And in that moment, Eleanor knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The courtroom was a battleground now. The air was thick with tension, the heavy oak benches casting long shadows under the stark courtroom lights. Eleanor sat at the witness stand, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. Across from her, Daniel's lawyer, a slick, sharp-dressed man with a cold, calculating smile, prepared to attack. "You'll have to forgive me, Your Honor," the lawyer began, turning to Judge Crawford, his voice smooth as he adjusted his glasses. "But we've heard quite enough of these accusations from Ms. Hayes. It's clear that her actions are fueled by confusion, and perhaps something worse." He turned to face Eleanor, his eyes narrowing. "Let's be clear. Eleanor Hayes isn't the victim. She is a woman on the edge, desperate to regain control, and willing to destroy her own family. She's confused, vindictive." The words landed with a force that rattled the air around them. Eleanor could feel the weight of them pressing on her chest, her fists clenching at her sides. He was trying to paint her as irrational, unstable, everything she had worked against for years, the very thing her son had always tried to make her out to be. Eleanor didn't flinch. She had weathered storms far worse than this. She could feel Naomi's calm presence beside her, the lawyer's steady voice a stark contrast to the venomous accusation. Naomi rose, her movements deliberate, and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "the claims being made by Daniel's defense are baseless, and we are prepared to prove it." She turned to Eleanor, her gaze firm but supportive. "Ms. Hayes has undergone a complete competence, and the results are conclusive. She is fully capable of managing her affairs. These allegations of confusion and instability are an attempt to discredit her, and they will not stand." Naomi presented the medical report, evidence from an independent doctor confirming Eleanor's mental acuity and ability to manage her estate. The documents were factual, irrefutable. The courtroom shifted slightly, a murmur of disbelief rippling through the audience as they read the conclusion. Eleanor sat tall, breathing in the calm of the moment. The truth was speaking for itself now. Daniel's lawyer was unfazed, however. He straightened his tie and took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. "But it's not just about confusion, is it, Ms. Hayes?" he pressed. "It's about bitterness. It's about revenge. A mother willing to destroy her own son to claim what's rightfully his." The insinuation stung, but Eleanor didn't respond. The quiet fury that had been growing in her chest for years swelled just beneath the surface, held in check by the knowledge that her fight was just and true. The truth was on her side, and no matter how hard they tried to smear her, it wouldn't change that. The lawyer continued, casting doubt on her intention, twisting her words to fit a narrative of vengeance. He moved to the next phase of his attack. "Let's examine the actions of Ms. Hayes' granddaughter, Claire Hayes," he said, gesturing toward Claire, who sat beside Eleanor, her hands folded in her lap. The lawyer's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Surely a young woman like Claire has no reason to testify against her parents. What does a teenager truly understand about finance, about the family business? Is she not being manipulated by her grandmother, drawn into this web of lies?" Eleanor's heart tightened, but she kept her expression. She could see the fear in Claire's eyes, the weight of the words pressing down on her. But Claire didn't shrink away. Claire stood slowly, her chin held high, her voice strong as she faced the room. "I'm not a child," she said, her gaze fixed on her parents. "I've seen the lies, the manipulation, the way Grandma was treated. I'm not going to let that happen any. Her words rang out in the quiet courtroom, and for a brief moment, even Daniel's lawyer faltered. Claire wasn't backing down. I've seen the record, I've heard the lies, and I'm here to tell the truth, she continued, her eyes never leaving the opposing counsel. I'm not afraid of what they've done. I'm not afraid of their threats. I'm here to stand with my grandmother. Naomi nodded in approval as she watched Claire, her face filled with pride. The case was slowly turning in their favor, the foundation of Daniel and Melissa's deceit crumbling piece by piece. Then, Detective Ray Porter stood. He had been quietly observing the proceeding, but now he stepped forward, presenting the final nail in the coffin. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm and clear, I've compiled a timeline of Daniel Hayes's fraudulent activity. The records don't lie. The money was funneled through multiple accounts, all linked to him. There are also several recordings of conversations where Daniel and Melissa discuss hiding their activities. The courtroom went silent as the recordings played, Daniel's voice unmistakable as he talked to Melissa about covering their tracks, about hiding their action the authorities. The room was filled with their cold, calculating words, and for the first time, Daniel's smug confidence wavered. Judge Crawford, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. I'm unimpressed with the theatrics, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The evidence speaks for itself. Eleanor felt a quiet surge of triumph. The battle had been hard, the stakes high, but the truth was undeniable. The lies had no place in the courtroom now. She sat tall, unbroken. Her hands, once clenched in anger, were now steady. Martha's hand found hers, squeezing it gently. You're doing it, Eleanor, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the judge, her heart steady. She had waited for this moment for so long, and now, nothing could break her. The storm had finally broken. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with the faint hum of whispers echoing off the high, dark wood beam. It had been weeks since the last hearing, and now, finally, the trial had begun. The moment of reckoning was at hand. Eleanor sat at the defense table, her face composed, though her heart beat with quiet. She had waited for this moment for so long. Naomi stood at the front, poised, her presence commanding as she addressed the. She was calm, confident, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that spoke of everything at stake. We begin with evidence, Naomi said, her voice clear and strong. The case before you isn't simply about one woman's fight for what's hers. It's about undoing a web of deceit, of exposing the truth that was hidden for far too long. She turned and gestured toward the table. A thick folder was placed before the judge, the pages inside holding the very proof that would tip the scales of the trial. Naomi flipped the folder open, revealing a yellowed document, an old will, its edges frayed by. The room went still as she laid the will before the judge, and then the deed to the property, both stamped and signed, confirming Eleanor's rightful owner. This, Naomi, her voice cutting through the silence, is the true will of George Hayes, Eleanor Hayes's late husband, not the fraudulent version that was presented in the earlier. This is the version that was hidden, locked away, until now. Eleanor's pulse quickened as the realization washed over her. This wasn't just a victory of words. It was a tangible shift in power. Daniel and Melissa had believed their lies would be enough to erase her. But now, this was the twist they hadn't seen coming. Naomi continued. This document, along with the deed to the property, affirms that Eleanor Hayes, and only Eleanor Hayes, is the rightful owner of this estate. There was no mistake. There was no error in the will. The fraudulent will presented earlier was a fabrication. The room was heavy with the weight of the truth. Daniel and Melissa sat across the room, their faces pale as they exchanged nervous glances. The once confident smugness had evaporated, replaced by the creeping realization that the foundation they had built their entire defense on was crumbling. Next, Detective Ray Porter stepped forward. He wasn't wearing his usual detective's attire, but the calm, steady authority he carried was the same. His testimony would be the final push that shattered Daniel's lies. Your Honor, Porter began, his voice even. The bank records we've compiled show multiple unauthorized transfers from the family, funds that were misused, funneled to personal accounts, spent on gambling debts and luxury items. The dates coincide with significant withdrawals, and in some cases, the transactions were disguised to look like legitimate. He held up a series of spreadsheets, each one outlining the fraudulent movements of money. The courtroom was silent as the details were read aloud. Melissa's name came up repeatedly. Credit card charges, high-end purchases that didn't match the family's. The evidence was damning. Eleanor watched as the color drained from Daniel's face. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to Melissa, who sat rigid, her jaw clenched in an almost defiant anger. The air in the room was thick with tension as the lies began to unravel. Then it was Claire's turn. She stood with shaking hands, her eyes red from the days of worry and sleepless nights. As she made her way to the stand, Eleanor's heart swelled with a mix of pride and anxiety. Claire had seen things no child should have to see, had heard things no daughter should have to hear. But she was standing tall now, unwavering, and that was all that mattered. Claire took a deep breath before speaking, her voice soft but clear. I didn't want to get involved in this. It's hard to see my parents, but I know what happened. I saw the text. I saw how they were lying, and I can't pretend. The room grew quiet, every eye on Claire as she recounted the conversations she had read between Daniel and Melissa. She had screenshotted them, collected the evidence in secret, and now she was telling the truth, unburdening herself of the guilt she had carried for so long. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she spoke of the manipulation, the lies, and the betrayal. I want you to know what she said, her voice breaking. I don't want to live in a world where lies win. Naomi moved in to comfort Claire after her testimony, giving her a moment to regain her composure. The jury watched closely, their eyes filled with empathy and understanding. The truth had a way of pulling people in, even when it was hard to face. But the real twist came when Melissa took the stand. She had been quiet until now, but as her lawyer led her through the question, her composure cracked. Under Naomi's expert cross-examination, Melissa's facade began to crumble. Ms. Hayes, is it true that you've been using the family accounts for personal expenses? Is it true that the charges made on your credit cards were well beyond what was justified? Naomi asked, her voice calm but unyielding. Melissa's mouth went dry, and she hesitated. For the first time, she looked like a person cornered. I didn't mean to, she began, but the words faltered. I thought it was just temporary. Naomi leaned in, her gaze intense. But it wasn't temporary, was it? This was a pattern, a deliberate choice to steal from the family, and you're willing to destroy your own mother-in-law, your son's grandmother, for the sake of appearances. The courtroom was deathly silent as the weight of Melissa's guilt hung in the air. She cracked under the pressure, her composure disintegrating. Eleanor sat tall in her seat, the truth sitting comfortably with her voice barely above a whisper as she looked at the jury, her words carrying an unspoken strength. Justice. The scales had tipped. Daniel and Melissa's empire of lies had crumbled. This trial had turned into their undoing, and Eleanor was finally, after years of silence and suffering, on the cusp of reclaiming what had always been hers. The storm was over, but the fight was not yet done. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but Eleanor hadn't moved. She sat in the stillness of her living room, the binder of evidence clutched tightly in her lap, the weight of it both heavy and comforting. Outside, the sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the world wrapped in the soft, quiet glow of early evening. The house felt different. The walls that had once felt confining, oppressive even, now seemed like silent witnesses to her journey. She had fought so long for this moment, and yet, as she sat there, time seemed to stretch and contract, each second heavier than the last. Martha sat beside her, her presence a steady anchor in the sea of tension. The two of them didn't speak much. There was no need for words. They both knew what was at stake, what the next few hours could mean. Every inch of Eleanor's body ached with the knowledge that the jury was deliberating, making their final decisions about her life. Claire had retreated to the kitchen, her fingers tapping nervously on the countertop as she paced back and forth. Eleanor could hear her footsteps, faint but persistent. Claire had been so brave throughout this process, so sure in her but tonight, the weight of it all had finally caught up with. Finally, Claire came into the room, her eyes red from a day of silent worry. She paused in the doorway, looking at Eleanor, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "Grandma," Claire whispered, her voice thick with a, "You'll win. You have to." Eleanor looked up at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with pride. "You've been my strength, Claire," she thought, her gaze softening as she met Claire's eyes. She opened her arms and Claire stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Eleanor, holding her tight. "I've never been more proud of you," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. "No matter what happened, You've helped me make it. Claire pulled back, looking at Eleanor with something more than admiration. There was an understanding there, an understanding that ran deeper than blood, than family. It was the understanding of shared courage, the kind that could only be forged through trial, through the crucible of life's most difficult battle. Naomi's phone call interrupted the moment of quiet tenderness. Her voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the edge of alertness. Eleanor, we're still waiting. The jury hasn't reached a decision yet. Eleanor took a deep breath, her grip tightening on the binder. How long do they think it will take? Could be another hour, could be longer, Naomi said. But stay close. I'll update you as soon as I hear anything. Eleanor hung up, the room falling silent. She stood slowly, walking over to the window. The night outside was almost deceptively so. The trees in the yard swayed gently, their leaves rustling softly. But inside, her heart raced. She pressed her hands against the cool glass, staring into the darkened. A prayer formed in her mind, soft and steady, though her voice was little more than a whisper. I've lived through storms before, God, but if this is what it takes, give me the strength to endure. Her breath fogged the glass, the quiet chill of the evening settling into her bones. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this. She thought of her late husband, George, and the life they had built together. She thought of the years of silence, of feeling unseen, unheard. She thought of Daniel, her son, who had once looked to her for guidance, now so lost as greed and his lies. She thought of Melissa, whose ambition had only fed the fire of betrayal, and of Claire, her granddaughter, the one bright light that had remained steadfast through it all. She opened her eyes, feeling a sense of calm wash over her, the weight of her prayer settling within her like a quiet storm. She turned back to the room just as the phone rang again. This time, it was Porter's voice on the other end. His words were blunt, but there was a note of finality in that struck Eleanor. They've reached a verdict, Porter said. It's time. Eleanor's hand went instinctively to her chest, the binder still clutched in her grip. It was done. The wait was over. But even as she felt the rush of emotion rise, her body stayed still. Her thoughts were clear. She had done everything she could. And now, it was in the hands of the jury. Thank you, Ray, she said, her voice steady. Let me know as soon as you hear anything. She hung up, her gaze shifting to Claire. They were both standing now, watching her, waiting. Eleanor turned back to the window, gazing out at the night that to stretch on endlessly before her. I've fought for this, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. And now, I wait. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind howling in the distance, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood firm, ready for whatever came next. And then, the phone rang again. Verdict's ready, the voice on the other end said. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the air in the room shift around her. The moment had come. The storm was at its center. The courthouse doors groaned open as Eleanor stepped through. The binder still nestled against her side like a lifeline. Claire walked beside her, one hand resting gently at her grandmother's back. Naomi was already ahead, her heels striking the marble floor with quiet purpose, while Martha trailed just silent but watchful. The courtroom was full when they entered, reporters lining the back wall, notepads poised, and curious townsfolk who had followed every twist of the case now eager for its end. The hum of whispered conversations stilled the moment Eleanor. Daniel was already there, flanked by his defense attorney. He looked smaller his suit too stiff, his face drained of its usual smug confidence. Melissa sat beside him, her posture stiff, her eyes flickering toward the exit every few seconds. The weight of consequence clung to them both like a fog. Judge Crawford entered moments later, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow. She settled into her chair with the poise of someone who had seen too much and grown tired of all of it. All rise, the bailiff called, and the courtroom obeyed. The jury filed in, a line of strangers carrying the fate of the room in their expression. No one spoke as they sat. No one breathed loudly. The foreman, a man in his 60s with a gentle face and a steady voice, stood and faced the judge. Madam Foreperson, Judge Crawford, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have, Your Honor. Eleanor's hands gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles whitened, but her expression remained calm. Naomi glanced sideways at her, giving the smallest nod. The foreman unfolded the paper slowly, as if the verdict itself weighed something. In the matter of Hayes versus Hayes, regarding claims of financial exploitation, undue influence, and civil fraud, we, the jury, find in favor of Eleanor. A collective gasp stirred through the courtroom. Somewhere in the back, someone began to clap before stopping themselves. The judge held up her hand. And in the matter of criminal liability for financial exploitation, the foreman continued, his voice unwavering now, we find the defendant, Daniel Hayes, guilty on all counts. Eleanor exhaled for the first time in what felt like Claire let out a choked sob and immediately buried her face into Eleanor's shoulder, her arms wrapping around her like the girl she used to be. You did it, she whispered, her voice trembling. You won, Grandma, you won. The foreman looked back at the paper and then at Melissa. We find Melissa Hayes complicit in misappropriation of joint marital funds, but recommend leniency given her secondary role and cooperation during trial. Judge Crawford cleared her throat. Given the evidence presented, the court sentences Daniel Hayes to 5 years in state prison, restitution in full to Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, and a permanent forfeiture of estate claim. Melissa Hayes will serve probation and community service, and her involvement in all financial matters moving forward is revoked. Melissa let out a sharp breath, her face crumbling beneath the weight of humiliation. Daniel didn't speak. He simply stared forward, unmoving, as if he'd detached from the world unraveling around him. Naomi sat down beside Eleanor, her calm cracking just enough to show a flicker of relief. It's done, she said softly. It's over. No, Eleanor murmured, her voice gentle but sure. It's just the beginning. Claire was still hugging her tightly, but now Eleanor turned and kissed the top of her head. There was a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years, a warmth not of victory, but of finally being heard. Finally. Martha reached forward, her wrinkled hand resting over Eleanor, her voice barely audible through the courtroom's stir. Survivor, she whispered. Eleanor turned to her old friend, her eyes glassy but dry. Always was, she replied. As the courtroom slowly emptied, reporters followed Naomi out the side doors asking for comment. The judge retreated to chambers. Daniel was escorted out the opposite way, his cuffs hidden beneath, but not his Eleanor stood in the center of it all, still, steady, quiet, not triumphant, just whole. Outside, the wind was beginning to. The first rays of morning pushed through the courthouse window, golden and new. She walked toward the door, binder still in hand, Claire beside her, Martha trailing close, and Naomi answering questions with crisp, perfect clarity. Before she crossed the threshold, Eleanor turned one last time to the courtroom, empty now except for the echoes of all that had happened. She smiled softly, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, for herself, for the woman who stayed silent too long, then decided to rise. And outside, the sun finally broke free of the clouds. The courtroom had all but emptied. The verdict had been read, the sentence handed down, and Eleanor Hayes stood at the precipice of something that felt almost like peace. But Judge Crawford hadn't left the bench. Her gavel remained untouched. Her gaze, sharp and unreadable, flicked between Naomi and the defense. Then she adjusted her glasses and tapped a single finger on the folder in front of her. One more matter, she said, her voice cool. This court received supplemental material this morning, unsealed under emergency motion, authenticated by independent parties, brought forth by an unexpected source. The murmurs began again. Naomi's brow furrowed ever so slightly. Crawford continued, reaching into a leather satchel that had been brought up quietly by the bailiff. These documents, she said, pulling out a thick, time-worn manila envelope, were discovered sealed beneath the original floorboards of the Hayes estate, specifically beneath the north wall of the old study, hidden in a hollow beam, locked in a fireproof tube. Submitted by Detective Ray Porter and verified this morning. Daniel flinched visibly. Melissa stiffened like she'd swallowed glass. Naomi turned slowly toward Eleanor, eyes wide for the first time in weeks. Judge Crawford slid the pages from the envelope with deliberate. Inside, she said, holding up the first, was a fully executed revocable trust, signed 15 years ago by George Hayes, irrefutably notarized, legally binding. She paused, letting the words settle. It places full ownership of the Hayes estate, associated assets and liquid reserves into the irrevocable control of one Eleanor Louise Hayes. The courtroom gasped. There was a pause, then stunned silence, broken only by the scraping of Daniel's chair as he jolted upright. What? He barked, standing. That's impossible. We never... Those papers didn't exist. Judge Crawford held up a hand like a command. Sit down, Mr. Hayes. I am not finished. He froze, eyes wild, chest rising with panicked breaths. Crawford turned another page, adjusting her glasses. Clause 12. The successor trustee is named Claire Elise Hayes. She is granted full successor rights, financial oversight, and legal control over the trust should Eleanor become incapacitated or choose to step down. Claire's mouth dropped open. I didn't know, she whispered. Martha squeezed her, tears welling in her eyes. Your grandfather did, she whispered. Crawford wasn't fit. Lastly, she said, lifting the final page, Clause 19. Daniel Hayes and Melissa Hayes are explicitly disinherited. No access, no appeal, no claim to any asset held in trust, per the express wishes of George Hayes, citing a consistent pattern of self-interest, financial recklessness, and disregard for family well-being. A thud echoed in the room. Melissa had dropped her purse. Naomi slowly stood, nodding toward the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to submit this discovery into permanent record. With this trust, all remaining probate disputes are resolved. Agreed, Crawford replied, slamming her gavel once. Daniel slumped in his chair, eyes hollow. Melissa sat stone-faced, mouth pressed into a single silent line of rage. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't gasp, didn't cry. She sat straight, her palms flat against the defense table, and closed her eyes for the briefest second. She could feel the old floorboards beneath her feet, the ones George had always insisted on fixing. He'd told her once, half joking, that if the truth ever needed hiding, the old study would keep it safe. He'd meant it. And now, even years after his death, her husband had returned, through paper, through ink, through intention, to protect her one last time. Across the room, Claire was crying again. Not from fear, from awe, from something like freedom. Martha leaned close, her voice shaking. He never stopped protecting you. Eleanor exhaled slowly. He knew what was coming, she murmured, even before I did. The press exploded into questions as the judge adjourned the court for good. Reporters crowded Naomi. Flashes went off. Microphones jutted forward. But none of it mattered to Eleanor. She stood. Not for applause, not for cameras, for herself. She turned once more toward Daniel and they couldn't meet her eyes. Not anymore. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had the truth. And the truth had waited, just beneath the floorboard, outliving lies, betrayal. As she stepped outside into the bright, honest sunlight, Eleanor whispered just loud enough for Claire and Martha to. These papers outlived cruelty. And somewhere deep in her chest, something finally let go. The front door creaked open with a sound Eleanor hadn't heard in years. Not like this. Not without dread clinging to. Afternoon sunlight poured in through the foyer window, drenching the floors in gold. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar, the scent of memory. Eleanor stepped inside, binder in hand, her footsteps quiet but confident. Claire followed with 2 boxes, setting them down just inside the old study. I'll get the rest from the car, Claire said, already halfway back out the door, her ponytail swinging. We're doing this right. Eleanor smiled softly and turned toward the hallway. The walls bore the faint shadows of paintings long removed. Daniel's modern update, she recalled. All sharp lines and soulless but now the house had begun to breathe again, to remember her. She walked slowly into her old bedroom. The room had been stripped down during Daniel's short reign, her floral curtains replaced, the walls painted in cold gray. The bed was still there though, and the window seat, the same view of the back orchard. The tree George had planted on their 10th anniversary still stood proud, even if the swing had long since fallen away. Claire returned, paint can. I got the color you loved, she said, grinning. Corn silk yellow, right? Eleanor nodded. It always caught the morning light. Together, they laid down drop cloths, laughing softly as Claire accidentally streaked a line of paint across her cheek. The first brush stroke Eleanor made felt like a reclamation, not just of the room, but of herself. With every sweep, she wiped away the years of silence, of powerlessness, of being a ghost in her own home. I didn't think I'd come back here like this, Eleanor murmured, dipping the brush again. Claire looked over, voice quiet. You didn't just come back, you won it back. In the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg drifted through the air. Martha hummed to herself as she pulled a pie from the oven, its crust golden and perfect. She wore an apron Eleanor hadn't seen in a decade, the one with the frayed hem and faded strawberries. It belonged in this kitchen. They all did. Martha glanced up as Eleanor entered, wiping her hands on a towel. Pie's almost ready. You're not allowed to touch it until we paint that whole room. Eleanor chuckled. Then you'd better hope Claire has a steady hand. Claire called from the hallway. I heard that. They all laughed, the sound rising up into the rafter it belonged, filling the house with something it hadn't felt in years, life. Later, as dusk wrapped around the house and the scent of baked apples lingered, Naomi arrived with the last envelope. She stepped in without knock. "Final paperwork," she said, handing it over with a smile. "The estate is secure. The titles are updated. Trust transferred. Claire's in the system as successor." Eleanor took the papers slowly, reverently. She opened the envelope and glanced over the top page, then nodded. Naomi leaned on the counter, relaxing for the first time in weeks. "You did it, Eleanor." "No," Eleanor said softly, eyes glancing toward the window, where the sun was just beginning to dip beneath the tree. "We did." She stood, binder in hand once more, and walked to the hallway closet. Hidden behind the coats was a small wall safe, dusty but unbroken. She punched in the old code, George's birthday. With a metallic click, the door opened. Eleanor gently placed the binder in, the same one that had been her sword and shield through the long months of courtrooms and doubt. She closed the safe and turned the handle. For the first time in a long time, she didn't need it anymore. The hardwood floor beneath her feet glowed with the last light of day, rich and golden. Claire curled up on the couch with a throw blanket. Martha poured tea. Naomi stood at the window, watching the light fade. Eleanor stepped into the center of the room. She looked at the ceiling, the beams, the worn edges of furniture she had picked out decades ago. Everything was older, but everything was hers. She pressed a hand to the banister, warm from the sun, and whispered to no one in particular. A quiet breath of belonging, home again. And for the first time in years, the house answered. The auditorium was packed. Rows upon rows of chairs were filled with women of every age, advocates, survivors, daughters, grandmothers. Some wore suits, others wore scarves wrapped in soft patterns. All were silent, waiting. Eleanor stood just off stage, fingers gently smoothing the front of her navy blouse. The lights cast a warm glow across the wooden podium, the kind of light that invited truth. Naomi leaned in beside her, tone quiet but firm. "You don't have to prove anything, Eleanor. Just speak." Eleanor smiled. "I'm not here to prove. I'm here to remember." Claire sat in the front row, flanked by Naomi and Martha. Her hands clutched her phone, not to record, but just to hold something steady. The MC stepped aside. "Please welcome our final speaker of the evening, Eleanor Hayes." The applause began polite, reserved. But as Eleanor stepped forward, something shifted. Her steps were slow, deliberate, not hesitant, but grounded. When she reached the podium, she placed a single folded paper beside her water glass. Then she looked up. The silence was total. "I'm not a public speaker," Eleanor began, her voice steady. "I don't have a degree in law or social work. I don't even own a smartphone that can take notes. But I do know something about silence and what it costs." She paused, letting the weight of her words. "I lived most of my adult life in a home I loved, with a man who saw me, respected me. And when he died, I believed I would be allowed to grieve. But grief became silent, and silence became erasure." Claire blinked quickly, her jaw tight. "My own son," Eleanor's voice caught, just for a breath. "My own family turned me into a ghost, took my home, spent what wasn't theirs, told people I was confused, vindictive, irrelevant." She looked out into the sea of faces, letting the confession settle. They almost won. The auditorium remained frozen. Eleanor reached for the folded paper and opened it slowly, revealing an old photocopy of the trust paper, one of the last remnants George had hidden beneath the floorboard. "But my husband," she said softly, holding the page with both hands, "had more faith in me than I had in my. He prepared for their lies. He left the truth under the floorboard." Gasps rippled quietly through the audience. 15 years ago, he signed a trust, buried it in a beam he rebuilt with his own hands, and when the time came, the house gave it back. Martha covered her mouth with one hand, tears forming. Eleanor folded the page again and set it down. "I fought in court, not because I wanted vengeance, not even because I wanted the house. I fought because I needed to prove, to myself, that silence doesn't mean surrender." A woman near the back stood, then another. Then the applause began, gentle at first, then rising. Eleanor didn't speak over it. She waited. When the room stilled again, she leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped, intimate now, fierce. "Respect is the foundation," she said. "Stronger than wood or stone. It's what holds the roof above your head, even when the world says you don't belong beneath it." Naomi nodded, just once. Claire wiped her cheeks, whispering, "That's my grandmother." Eleanor looked out over the crowd one last time. If you've ever felt invisible, if someone tried to bury your truth beneath shame or control or cruelty, just know this. The floorboards remember. She stepped back from the podium slowly. No music, no fanfare, just Eleanor Hay, steady, unbroken, and free. She crossed the stage, the applause chasing her all the way to the curtain. Naomi reached for her shoulder. Claire was already waiting in the wings, her arms wide. Eleanor didn't cry, didn't tremble, she smiled, and just before stepping out of the light, she whispered, with the clarity of a woman who had reclaimed every inch of her story. And under the floorboards, I found not just papers, I found myself.